want to continue today. We spent a lot of time last class period looking at concepts, terminology, a lot of what we've referred to kind of as foundation building. We want to continue to that today, and then we'll begin to start to kind of get into some of the key content of the course. First off, what we want to do is take a look at some basic assumptions about human development. And again, these are things that we'll kind of build on and elaborate on. Number one, there are basic human needs. Real quickly, just throw some out. What is a human need that we all have? Food and shelter, basic necessities of life. What else? Beyond those? Love. A couple of others. What are other just basic human needs? Sleep? Did somebody say?
Like rest.
Rest. Okay, excellent. What else? Just basic human needs, something that we all need. Interactions with others, okay. What else? Just basic human needs. I think we all need to feel a sense of purpose and meaning in our lives. Sense of the interaction with others relates to a sense of belonging, connectedness. The important thing is to understand that we have basic human needs. And how it ties into human development is the quality of our development in our lives is going to be related to how well those needs get met. And that'll make more sense as we kind of move through the semester. A second just basic assumption is the development occurs in predictable sequence. Not necessarily all, but a lot of aspects of development that we look at, we will see some patterns, like I said, some predictable kinds of sequence. I'm going to give you two just real simple ones that all of you, I think, can identify or relate to. One of the things we see real clearly is walking. A child learning to walk will go through a very predictable kind of pattern or sequence. What would be the first step? First part of that sequence? Crawling. Exactly. You'll see a child that will crawl on the floor, and then almost all children, what will be the next part of that sequence? Well, standing or beginning to pull themselves up. A lot of times you'll see a child begin to pull themselves up on an object, maybe a table like this, an end table, or a chair. Did anyone know what the next sequence is? Unless you've had an opportunity to observe it, it may not be as obvious, but they tend to do something else following that pulling up. They'll start to do a little bit of balancing, and then they'll do something else. Anyone who's ever watched a child learn to walk? If they were to pull themselves up on this table right here, what would they begin to do? Walk along the table. They begin to kind of graze around the table, and then after they've gotten fairly comfortable with that, they'll then start to, what would you guess? They'll begin to let go of the table and will begin to take that first step. Typically will fall, pull themselves back up, and then all of a sudden one day they're up and running. But you'll begin to see a fairly typical, predictable sequence or pattern of learning to walk, and most children will move through that same pattern. Another common one is if you look at language development. Again, you'll see a very predictable kind of sequence. Child first beginning to babble, meaningless kind of utterances or sounds. Soon we'll begin to speak the first word, and we can begin to see a pattern of combining 2 or 3 words together, and then eventually beginning to put short sentences together, and then longer sentences, and increasing their vocabulary. But it's a fairly common, predictable pattern or sequence that we can see. And you'll see that in much of what we'll be talking about during the semester, how those patterns begin to develop. I think one of the things that you'll realize as we move through the semester, and we don't need to say a lot about it today, is that human development is complex. It's impacted by many interrelated factors. And in a moment, we're going to talk some about theory and what theory is, and that will help us understand a little bit more fully the complexity of human development. And you'll see that throughout our discussions of the semester. So there are basic human needs. Development occurs in a predictable sequence. Much of it does. Human development is complex, impacted by many interrelated factors. And finally, human development behavior can be explained from a variety of theories. Now, 2 points underneath that is that there is no theory that is comprehensive. Now, as we look at today, begin to look at and talk about what theories are and look at some of the theories that serve as a foundation for this course, we might look at and say, well, gosh, wouldn't it be nice if we just came up with one theory? One theory that would explain all about human development. Why would that not be possible? People are different. Excellent. And it's hard to find any one theory that would fit everyone. Why else would that be problematic? Just one big theory.
Well, you're at a certain stage, you can't really expect to understand the next stage if you haven't experienced it. So you're just not capable of understanding the whole thing at once.
All right. One of the things is if there was one theory that explained all the stages and all aspects of development, it would be so massive, it would be hard to really understand, comprehend something that big. And so what theories tend to do is to simply break it down, and different theories tend to look at a specific aspect of development, kind of like pieces of a puzzle. And different theories tend to give us different pieces of the puzzle. And then when we look at how those theories are related, then we get a better sense of an understanding of human development in its bigger picture. It is important to be aware that no one theory is universally accepted. There are some that strongly believe this theory makes sense, it works for me. Others would say the theory is not valid, isn't as relevant as another theory. And so I'm going to present some of the theories that we will use throughout the semester and refer to. And you may look at some of those and say, well, I'm not sure I really buy that. And that's okay. Because again, no one theory is universally accepted by everyone. Though what we're going to do is kind of look at some of the theories that would be considered somewhat classic theories that if you read virtually any human development book, you'll see those theories kind of focused on. And I think they've been researched enough to be fairly valid, at least in what they're attempting to explain, even though they have continued to be revised and modified over the years. So before we look specifically at the theories that we're going to be talking about, I think it's important that we have a general understanding about what a theory is. Now, some of you in other courses may have already studied this, and you may be very familiar with what theories are, but we want to do at least a very quick review. A theory is a set of logically related concepts and propositions that describe the relationship between variables with the purpose of carrying out human development goals. A set of logically related concepts and propositions. And a proposition is nothing more than a statement that's describing the relationship between two things. And its purpose is carrying out human development goals. Now, let's just see, quick review. Anyone remember one of the 4 human development goals that we talked about last session? Describe. Excellent. Anyone remember one of the other 4? Explain. Great. Anyone want to take a shot at the last 2 without looking at your notes? Predict. Excellent. And then there was a 4th one. Modify. Great. If you can do that without looking at your notes, then you're going to have no difficulty on that test time. But describe, explain, predict, modify are the human development goals. Now, let's play with this for just a second as you continue to kind of write down notes. Let's build a theory. We're going to build a couple of theories. And so what we want to do is look at the relationship between variables. So let's do something we all identify with. Our goal is to get an A in this course. So we want to build a theory. And our theory is what are going to be the relationship between some variables to help us get an A. So what do you think would be a factor? What do you think it's going to take to get an A in this class? And this would be true for any class. Okay, so one of the variables is attendance. Now we're talking about relationships. So our proposition or our hypothesis is what then? If okay, if we attend classes more regularly, then we're likely to get a better grade than if we don't. So that's one proposition. We're not going to do all the possible ones, just 2 or 3. What's another one? Studying. And so let's just put it in simple terms. Let's just say the amount of studying we devote to the course, both in terms of notes and reading, will increase the grade that we get. We need another one. We've got studying, we've got attendance. What might be another factor, another variable, with our goal being getting an A in this class? Homework, well, okay, doing well on the test, which we hope attendance and studying will be related to. All right, taking notes, paying attention. And maybe those are combined, or maybe they're even 2 separate ones. Do I take good notes, and how attentive am I to what's happening in class. So we got 3 or 4 propositions. Now, we list those down, and our basic position is that if I come to class regularly, if I study, if I take good notes, and if I'm attentive, I should do pretty well. So, can we now just assume that that theory is valid? That if we do those things, we're likely going to get a good grade? Why not? We've got to test it. Exactly. So, what we then do is the second part of the equation is we need to conduct research. And research again, and research and theory go together. Theory builds the research, gives us a foundation. The theory gives us the foundation, and the research helps us give validity to that. So research is systematic, controlled, and in critical investigation of hypothetical propositions. And that's what we just created. We created hypothetical propositions, i.e., if I come to class, likely going to get a better grade. Now, it makes sense, it may be logical, but we need to test that. Now, can someone just real quickly, what would be a way we might be able to test that one proposition?
Do all that stuff for a class for a semester or something?
Okay, and what we could do is compare grades. And again, that by itself may not prove anything, but we could compare grades of those who attended regularly compared to those who didn't attend as regularly and see if we see a variation in those grades. Now, there could be a lot of other factors apart from attendance alone. So we may have to create some different kinds of controls to really be able to determine whether attendance itself really was a key factor. But there are some ways that we can develop some control measures to determine whether attendance, the amount of time spent studying, attentiveness may be a little bit harder to tap into, but we could then test that, and then if we found that to be valid, and it would give support to our theory. And a lot of times people think, well, if I test something and it doesn't prove to be true, then it's not useful. That's not necessarily true. It may just begin to help us identify that maybe that variable wasn't as important as other variables, and maybe we've left something out. Now, let's just take something related in terms of theory for just a moment, related to this course. One of the things that's been researched a lot, and most people tend to hold true, is that an individual's self-esteem is important to their human development. Now, let's say we wanted to develop a theory to look at factors that impact having a positive self-esteem or having a good feeling about yourself. What would be a proposition? What would be a hypothesis that we might create or want to look at and study in terms of self-esteem? What do you think is one thing that might impact your self-esteem? Okay, the amount of encouragement that a person receives in the course of their lives could be very directly related to how they feel about themselves. So we might want to look at the more encouragement I receive, the higher my self-esteem. What would be a couple of others? Things that you think impact a person's self-esteem. Excellent, accomplishments. And not necessarily in one area, but maybe in several areas of their lives. And the basic hypothesis would be the more accomplishments I've had, the higher my self-esteem is. Or the reverse of that, the lack of accomplishments might result in lower self-esteem. How about one more? Something else that you think is key to having a positive self-esteem. Excellent. We could take a look at maybe both not only the number of friends, say, that you have, but the quality of those friendships. And with the basic belief that, the higher the quality, the better those relationships, the more positive my relationship with my parents is, the higher my self-esteem is likely to be. And then likewise with those propositions, we could come up with a study, a way of researching that, investigating that critically with some kind of control measures to see if indeed those hypotheses tend to hold true. And that's kind of how we build theory. We build theory coming up with kind of educated guesses of what we think might be related to this particular aspect that we're wanting to study, and then we attempt to test it. So what we want to do with that is to begin to take a look at, again, just an overview, because we'll go in much more detail as we move through the semester of some of the theories that we will carry throughout our course. One of the theories that we want to look at, and you want to have a basic understanding of, is what we call ecological theory. Uri Bronfenbrenner believed that the social context, the environment that people grow up in, plays an important role in their development. It's not the only aspect, but it's clearly one important one. And so Urey and others that followed him that looked at this in terms of aspects of society. Urey Brofenbinder believed that there were 5 subsystems that make up the social context of which individuals grow and develop over the course of their lives. What you're going to need to know for the test purposes is simply to understand the basis of each one of these systems and how they're different from the others. And we'll look at some examples that will hopefully make that make sense to you. The first subsystem is microsystem. And I'm going to put another slide up in a moment to kind of help you see this whole theory as a whole. Is where the most direct interactions with others takes place. Microsystem is where the most direct interactions with others take place. Now, I'm going to put this back up in just a second. But this is looking at ecological theory as a whole. And again, here we're talking about the individual. And this is the individual at any stage, any age. We often think of it in the context of children, but it could relate to you right now. And so the microsystem is the first subsystem. And the easiest way to understand the microsystem, it's those settings where you have direct interactions with other individuals. So if you think of your own life, what are some of your current microsystems? Where are the places that you have the most direct, face-to-face, daily interactions with other individuals? School would be one, i.e. your classes, interactions with teachers, interactions with other students. What are some other microsystems that are a part of your life? Again, depending upon what your situation is. Clearly, if you live in a dorm, you've got interactions daily, particularly if you have roommates. You have daily interactions with roommates, and I would say that they have some impact on your life. You have interactions with others who live in that dorm. If you're close enough, you may still have regular interactions with family, home environments. And obviously, if we're talking younger stages in our lives, families played a very critical daily interaction in who we became and who we become. A couple of others, microsystems that exist in your life, or might at least exist in someone's life, where daily interactions take place. We've got places where we reside, live. School, work would be another one in terms of, both in terms of co-workers as well as, depending upon the nature of your work, those that you encounter, and is the nature of your job. For some, it may be church, maybe not on a daily basis, but on a regular basis, interactions with others. So when we talk about microsystems, we're talking about where direct interaction, the most direct interaction takes place. Now, the second, and I'm going to put another slide up in a moment to try to illustrate this, subsystem is the mesosystem. It involves interactions between microsystems. Involves interactions between the microsystems. Okay, now I'll put that back up in a second if you didn't have a chance to finish writing it down. This is the same model, just illustrated a little bit differently. And what this illustrates, here's the individual. Here it happens to have child listed. And this represents the microsystems, just outlined a little bit differently. Again, they got family, school, peer group or friends, church, the media, neighborhood, And the mesosystem represents this space right in here. Now, anyone want to take a shot at what that represents? What's it mean when we talk about the interaction between microsystems? Any thought at all? What's that represent? And it could be any combination of interaction between any of these microsystems. Any thought at all? Excellent. Excellent. We talk about the mesosystem being the relationship or the interaction between home and school. And that the child is impacted by that relationship. Because what's going to happen is if you have a child that's having difficulty at school, in some kind, be that academic or maybe some social difficulty, what's likely going to happen at some point in time? If you got a child and they're having difficulty at school, what's likely going to happen?
The teacher would call the parent.
Teacher is going to call the parent and probably ask for a parent-teacher conference. So the parent comes in, sits down with the teacher with the hope or the goal of doing what? Yeah, simply somehow working together, the interaction between parents and teachers to address a problem or to address an issue, with the hopes that together they'll come up with some kind of a strategy that will help that child either socially interact differently or more effectively if that's the issue, or if they're having difficulty with some part of their academic performance, that together they can come up with some way to address that. Again, it's looking at the interaction between more than one microsystem. And you could look at any combination of those. You can look at the relationship between the neighborhood and the home. How many grew up in a neighborhood, it was not my experience for the most part much of my life, but where everybody knew everyone else. And if you did anything wrong, your parents were likely going to find out about it. A couple of you can identify with that. Again, it's that kind of interaction between the neighborhood and the home that's so close, people know each other, and they literally work together. And it's kind of like having a lot of different parents when you live in that kind of a neighborhood. People kind of watching out for each other. An example of that or the kind of neighborhood situation where each other is really willing to help out one another when there's a problem, that might arise. And so again, it's showing that interaction or that overlap. There's an overlap or an interaction between home and peer group. I know in our household, we're very, very intentional about who Matthew is friends with, who Matthew plays with. He won't go to somebody else's house until we've met the family and we've met the parents. We meet the kids that come to our house and kind of get a sense about what they're like. It's that interaction between our household and the peer group. So again, when we talk about the mesosystem, we're talking about where different microsystems interact, relate to each other, knowing that they have some impact, again, on that individual's development. So, microsystem, where most direct interaction takes place. Mesosystem involves the interaction between microsystems. But the third system is the exosystem. Here you've got your microsystems, you've got the interaction, and laying outside of that, and probably the best example or illustration is a parent's work. Now think about the parent's work in relationship to the individual. How does the parent's work impact that individual? And in this context, we'll think of it in the case of a child. Anyone want to take a shot at what this system represents? School board would be another example. City councils would be another example of an exosystem. And there's no reason why you would know this, but it kind of stretches you to think about it a little bit. Carl?
I'm going to say that the parent's work, if the parent is traveling frequently, the child is not going to get to see the parent as often.
All right. It's an excellent example, of what the exosystem is. So what is it? What is that exosystem?
The time is spent away from the individual.
It can be a part of that. Is the child directly involved in that system? They're not involved directly in that system, but what? They're affected by it. Exactly what the illustrations that both of you came up with. If my work requires a lot of my time, and say particularly a lot of my time to travel or be gone, that's going to have a direct impact on the nature of my interaction with my child, and my child's going to be impacted by that. Now, can you think of another couple of examples of how the work environment could impact an individual's development or the home environment? Time is clearly one, and it's a good example. Yeah, if you're in a job that's high stress or that you're extremely unhappy in, is that going to impact how you interact with family members? And some of you probably can identify that from your own life. What happens? Parents come home, they're stressed, they're frustrated. What's going to be the impact, do you think?
Kids pick up on that and then they feel those emotions too. They get anxious and frustrated.
Kids pick up on that. They may feel some of those emotions, or it may impact my ability to be maybe patient and understanding, either with my spouse or with my child. It's going to impact those dynamics. So what we've got here then is the exosystem is when experiences in a social setting, such as work, in which the individual does not have active role. Again, if we're looking at it in the context of a child here, child doesn't go to work for the most part with the parent. They're not actively involved in that setting, but it does influence the individual's experiences of life. Another simple example, if you think about, again, the setting of the workplace, the financial resources that's provided by that work setting will have a direct impact on the child's development. If the parent has a fairly high-paying job, what's that going to provide for that child? Maybe differently than someone who is in lower social economic status. What would the higher?
More opportunities.
Exactly, more opportunities. Yeah, in terms of school, extracurricular activities, and that's going to have an impact. Again, even though the child is not directly involved in that setting or have an active role in that setting. Let's take another setting real quickly. The school, say a school board. For the most part, children don't participate in school board activities or make decisions, but does a school board have any impact whatsoever on a child's development or on a child's experiences of life? What would be a couple of examples? How does a school board impact a child's life or development in some way?
They cut programs, like budget cuts, they take stuff out.
Exactly. They have a tremendous impact on determining what programs are offered, where the funding goes. And we've seen with schools that have struggled with finances, cutting some programs. And particularly if it cuts a program that maybe your child particularly was invested in, or interested in. What else? That we see a lot of discussion that school boards play a key role in, that will have a direct impact at least on some children. Good example there. Can you think of another? School closings. Big one right now. Lots of discussion. And families feel very impacted by that. And children feel very impacted by that. What else? The school boards tend to have a lot of influence or decision-making power in. Discipline and what discipline is allowed. Curriculum, in terms of what courses are offered or what cannot be offered, that's going to have an impact. Another major one is school boards have a key role in determining who gets hired, who doesn't get hired. So it has an impact on who your children's teachers are. Another one, I haven't heard much about it, but where I was living before, there was lots of discussion, and a lot of school boards were having conversations about school uniforms. Here we're talking about public schools now. And there's lots of debates over what that would mean for children if they're required to have to wear certain clothes. And those are decisions that school boards can make that would then filter down and have a direct impact, again, on a child. All right, exosystem. The fourth subsystem is the macro system. And this involves the larger society or culture in which individuals live. The easiest way to think of this is kind of the society as a whole. Involves the larger society, culture in which the individual lives. It includes, or a part of that would include political ideology. We'll come back and talk about a couple of these in a moment. In many cases, it may mean religion, because in some societies, religion plays a very central role in what happens within that society, particularly in terms of shaping beliefs, values, and morals. It reflects the economics of the society at that moment. What's something that's happening in our society right now that's impacting families and could ultimately have an impact on individuals within? Gas prices. And what's beginning to happen now is gas prices have continued to go up and kind of stay up. Families are having to restructure their finances, deciding what am I going to do without or less of in order to continue, to meet those rising costs. Do you think that politics and what political party is in control has any impact on our lives at all? How so? Anyone think of just one example without getting into a political debate? How does political ideology and what political party tends to be in control at a given time influence our lives? Taxes, exactly. And lots of discussion right now in terms of tax policy and how taxes should be determined. A couple other quick examples. Funding for federal programs and what programs are available. And if you're a parent or a family with a child that has certain special needs and that program's been cut out, you're directly impacted. Others may not be, but some families directly are. And so they set varieties of policies that impact our lives, for sure. Okay, so when we talk about, and then within a given society, there are certain values that tend to get instilled or emphasized. I don't think they're out there like on a neon light that says, here's what is important or is emphasized within our culture. And here I'm talking kind of the mainstream culture of America. But can you think of anything that our society, if you grew up in this country, tends to get emphasized? Maybe subtle, but it's emphasized pretty strongly. Anything comes to mind that we tend to put a lot of value on in our society? I think achievement. And I think along with that achievement would be competition. I think we put a strong emphasis on competition, on achievement. What else do we tend? And again, it's not a question of right or wrong. But if you look at different societies, different cultures, they tend to put emphasis on different things. If you look at a Native American culture, at least traditionally, competition is not a strong emphasis. What else do we tend to emphasize pretty strongly within our larger society, do you think? What's that? Wealth. I mean, I think we put a lot of value on material possessions. We may not think about it consciously, but one of our motivations is to do as well as we can financially. Whether we need it or not, we tend to be driven to accumulate things. Can you think of another one? Attractiveness tends to be something that we put a lot of emphasis on in our society. And every culture defines that differently. And there's a lot of financial resources that goes into trying to become whatever that image of attractiveness is and to maintain that over the course of our life. So again, good examples. So we've looked at the microsystem, mesosystem, the exosystem, macrosystem, cultures as a whole, and then finally, the chronosystem. This is probably the hardest one to grasp, but it really represents the influences of a given time period and the events that occur within it. Over the course of our life, we grow up within a certain time period. And during the course of our lives, there very well will be significant events. And those events will influence the society we live in that will then also have an influence on our lives and our development. Now, this should be a fairly easy question, but what are some events that have occurred within your lifetime up to this point that you think have had a tremendous impact on society? And if those events had occurred, life would not be the same. Your experiences of life would not be the same. 9/11. I mean, I think that's one of the things that almost immediately comes to mind. And once that occurred, and many of us can remember very distinctly the day, the time, what we were doing, but our lives have never been the same since that. And we are continuing to be impacted by the events of that day. Can you think of another event that's occurred within your lifetime that you think has an impact on our experiences, and to some extent an impact on who we've become and how we live our life?
I don't know if it's an event, but like the internet.
Excellent. Something that's a part of that time period. And again, I think back and almost humorously joke at back when I was a child. Computers, technology, cell phones, those things didn't exist. And for my son, they're commonplace. And it's interesting now when adults my age have to go to their children to get help with technology. But it's a statement about this time period and how life is different and how development is impacted by those changes and by those events. And will continue to be a part of. And so when we look at that part of the subsystem, we're just simply looking at the time period of which we grew up in, which we lived in, and how that impacts development. Now, just real quickly to kind of give you a different context, can you think of a different era of life that you would like to have lived in? If you could go back in history to any time period, can you think of a time that you think might be interesting to live some period of time in? Anybody think of any era that you'd just like to spend some time in? Maybe not permanently, but just to see what it was like. 70. Now, see, I find that interesting because, see, for you, that's to go back. I grew up in the 70s as a kid. And I keep forgetting that for you in this room, that's history. That's a different time period. That's a part of my chrono system kind of thing. But the 70s was a fascinating period of time to live. Do you think if you grew up in the 70s that you would be any different a person today? Yeah, probably. We don't know how, but in some way you would be different. Be that just attitudes or the way that you look at life would be a little different, having lived in that period. Anyone else? Different period, time in life that you'd like to have lived or experienced? Early 1800s. All right. Excellent. Anyone else? Just a different era, time period. I'd like to go back to the Wild Wild West. Strap on my guns, walk the streets. You know, and my guess is that if we lived in a different time period, a different era, our experiences of life, how we developed, would be impacted in some kind of way. Now, basically on the test, the way that's going to kind of work is I'm going to give you a description, you know, kind of like the school and home kind of description that I gave you. And all you simply will have to do is to be able to identify which of these 5 systems that most relates to. So again, if you kind of understand how those systems are related, but the distinct difference. Again, that microsystem, the place where the most direct interactions occur. Mesosystem, just remember, it's where 2 or more microsystems interact. The exosystem, those settings that the individual is not directly involved in, but is impacted by. Macrosystem's pretty easy. It's just that broader society. And then chronosystem is just talking about the time period and the events. The difficulty I think students have are with the first 3, keeping those kind of separated and how they're different. But that's where the questions will be. Just a description, and then you just simply will select which of those 4 choices out of those 5 that it is. So anyway, ecological theory. I encourage you to review those, look at those periodically, because again, for many of you, it's the first time you've been introduced to it. If you sit on that and let it ride for a long time, it won't be as familiar when you come back to it 2 or 3 weeks from now for the exam. Now, this is a system, this is a theory that it's easy to understand. You all, I think, can relate to it. For those that have had intro to sociology, psychology, you've probably come across these theories before, and for many of you it may simply be a review. But social learning theory, this is probably one of my favorite theories just because I seem to live it and experience it almost every day. Social learning theory, simple terms, is that individuals learn. And again, remember, we're not talking about all of learning occurs as a result of a given theory. But we do know that some of the things that we learn, some of our behavior patterns in our lives, are the result of having simply observed somebody else and imitating that behavior. And we're going to look at some examples in a moment. But there are 4 processes that take place, that work together in order for learning to take place. Now, what is learning? Learning is behavior that's repeated over time. So it's something that has to have lasting permanence to it for it really to be considered learning. First step, or first part of the process, a person must attend to the behavior of someone else. Now, I put in capital letters here the word attend. What's significant, do you think, to the word attend? I could have put in there observe or witness or see, but I'm not sure that captures what it really takes for social learning to take place. What's attend imply? Differently from just simply observe.
Participation.
In a sense, if you attend to something, what do? Excellent. You actively think about it, or at least you actively focus on it. You all can come into this room right now, and you are in this room and you're observing what I'm doing and what I'm saying. It does not necessarily mean what. Hopefully it does, but it doesn't necessarily mean what. You can hear it, you can see it, but you may not necessarily do what?
Thinking about it or focusing on it.
Yeah, you may not necessarily really be thinking about it, processing it, focusing on it. So it may at times simply be words that kind of come in and go where? What is that?
I just said straight back out.
Straight back out or just lost somewhere. And if that happens, is learning likely going to take place? No. In order for learning to take place and be lasting, we can't only observe something, but we need to attend to it. Focus on it. In some cases, think about it, but somehow internalize that in some kind of way, if indeed it's something that's going to be remembered, repeated. So we have to first attend to a particular behavior, focus on it for some reason, because there's a lot of things we see and we just never pay any attention to it, and it's soon forgotten. Now, once we've attended on it, if learning takes place, the behavior must be remembered. So there's a lot of things that we observe that we simply never remember. And it's probably because we didn't give it a lot of focus, a lot of attention originally. But for learning to take place, it cannot occur if we don't remember it. And you know that experience from your academics in the sense that so often there are things you've seen, you've heard, somehow you don't remember it, and so it's hard to do anything with that information. So we attend to the behavior of someone else, we remember it, and then what must we do? And for it to really be considered learning, what would be the next logical step? Imitate it, excellent, or repeat it. Now, we're going to repeat it in a different setting. It may not be exactly the way that we observed it, but it is a result of having observed somebody else do it, remembering it, and then repeating that in some other setting, of which would not have occurred if we had not somehow witnessed that, observed that someplace else. Now, this is what's most important. Somehow put a star by it, because most people think this is the last part. It's not. There's a fourth part, and the test will trick you if you don't realize that. Repeating it isn't the final part of the process. For learning to take place and to have a lasting effect, the behavior must be reinforced. If reinforcement is not there, what's likely going to happen to the behavior? It'll be forgotten or likely not to be repeated in any kind of way simply because it's lost any kind of meaning. It has to be either positively, negatively reinforced in some kind of way for that behavior to continue. So put a star by that because it's the reinforcement that's the final part of the process, not the repeating of the behavior. Now, I'll give you a couple of just examples, and we'll see if you can generate some examples, again, maybe out of your own experiences of life. I want to give you a simple example of reinforcement and how reinforcement tends to work. Young child, 4 years of age, has been to preschool for a short period of time, and they are sitting around the dinner table, and you've had friends over. And so you're having a conversation, and something occurs, and the 3 or 4 year old child all of a sudden says, "Oh, shit." Now, what would be the common reaction, which was the reaction of 3 or 4 of you immediately to that child's verbal response? You laugh. Now, you laugh because probably you're the parent or one of the other adults around the table.
You don't want them to learn things.
Well, what's your laughter originally coming from? Why do we just instinctively laugh? Most of you did, or at least smiled.
Mine would be that I would be surprised that they picked up on the behavior.
Exactly. I mean, what happens is parents are just like surprised that those words came out of their child's mouth. Now, if you're me, the first thing that goes through your mind after you laughed is, okay, did I ever say that? Is that where my child learned it? And all of a sudden, very quickly, you realize those were not words that you shared in the household. So where did that child likely to learn that word? A preschool or somebody else must have said it, and they obviously did what?
Attended to it.
They obviously attended to it, and then on top of that, they remembered it, and what did they do at the dinner table? They repeated it. Now, the moment you laughed, what did you do, at least momentarily? Reinforcement. Because what did you say to the child with your laughter? Not your intent, but what did you communicate to the child? I'm sorry?
That it was funny and it's okay.
Yeah, because your laughter says it was okay, and now you have just entertained us at the dinner table. Now, it was not your intent, and it's probably the next time the child repeats those words, the reinforcement probably will be in a different form, which will create confusion for the child. Why it was funny and okay one moment, and now I'm in big, big trouble the next time. But our reaction to that behavior may likely become a reinforcement that will then continue that behavior. So I'm going to look at a couple of other simple kinds of examples, and it can spread across all kinds of different themes, just in terms of, and again, we talk a lot about how what adults do in the lives of children and what they model, children indeed attend to, will remember, will repeat, and will continue if it's reinforced. I teach a family economics course in addition to a number of other courses. And those who have been in that course with me know me, and my wife would tell you and my son would tell you that I tend to be, I call it thrifty. My family would say that I'm cheap, And I'll be honest with you, I'm one of those that when I go in, and my son loves McDonald's, but when I go into McDonald's, I tend to go immediately to the value menu. I buy virtually everything off the dollar value menu. And I'll never forget the day, and my son was much younger than he is now, and we went to McDonald's and we ate, and my son turned to me and says, "Dad, aren't you proud of me? I got everything off the value menu." And all of a sudden it just hit me very quickly, where did he learn that? He learned it from watching, observing what I do, and then repeating it. Probably the most humorous one that still exists in our household today, and it clearly is social learning, something that you often don't think about, is our current family battle over the remote control. My son will come into the room that I'm in. Now, he has his own room, his own TV, but he'll come into my room and he'll immediately grab the remote control and change the channel. But that's not the most annoying thing. He will, in between commercials, change to about 5 other stations, And then I will look at him and say, "Matthew, why do you keep changing the channel?" And he quickly turns to me and he says, "Dad, it's exactly what you do." And he is exactly right. It is exactly what I do. But isn't it amazing that that which we do is only annoying when somebody else does it? And he learned it from me. I am terrible and drives my wife crazy. She will watch one show, commercials, the whole thing. I don't like commercials. I can watch 3 football games all at the same time and throw in a movie at the same time. I just bounce from one in between when I get bored and I go to another one. And all of a sudden I realized that my son had observed those behaviors and he repeats them. I have to be really cautious of the things that I say, around him, because he watches, he pays attention, and unfortunately repeats and remembers a lot of the things that I have said, and have done. Can you think of very quickly, and I know it's hard on the spot, can you think of a mannerism or a behavior pattern that exists in your life today that's probably a result of having watched a sibling or a parent that you just simply continue today, but you probably are modeling the behavior that you learned growing up? Anybody happen to think of something? And I know it's hard to do that just off the top of your head. Anyone?
In kindergarten, we always had to sit with our hands in our lap, like Indian style, with our hands in our lap, and still today, I will do that, just because that's what we had. We always did. That's what everybody did.
Yeah. And one of the things that happens is a lot of times is as we continue those behaviors over time, they become learned behaviors. You probably don't even think about that you do it. You just automatically, and that becomes the reinforcement. It's a learned behavioral pattern, in your life. Anyone else think of just something? It could be a mannerism, could be a behavior, and all of a sudden we realize it's something that how we interact with others and relate to others are often learned behaviors from having observed others. Others will tell you, my wife will tell you that a lot of times when I don't particularly like somebody, I just ignore them and stay away and kind of avoid them. It's just kind of a pattern that I've learned. And I learned that from watching people in my family, and that's how they react or relate.
I observed my mother biting her nails when I was younger, and now I still have the habit and I can't stop.
Exactly. And when you begin to think about it, you can start to think about a lot of things in your lives, a lot of the behaviors that you exhibit, mannerisms, behavior patterns, how you communicate, how we listen, how we solve conflicts. A lot of those are simply learned behaviors from having observed someone else, remembering them, repeating them, and somewhere along the lines them being reinforced, even if it's only the satisfaction of how to resolve anxiety or something from that. And we'll continue that until we intentionally do something something different. Our next class period, we'll take a look at the 2 or 3 other key theories that we'll be looking at.